to the Music History 1 Chapter 12 video lecture. Chapter 12 is the last chapter in the Renaissance, titled The Rise of Instrumental Music. So, essentially, in the 1500s, for the first time, people began to write instrumental music specifically. Before that time, a lot of times if people played something on instruments, they were just playing vocal music on instruments, or they were accompanying singing. But in the 1500s, for the first time, people began to write instrumental music as an abstract art form, not necessarily to accompany dancers, or as I said, to copy vocal music. So, because of this new interest in instrumental music, they came up with some new instruments, and they came up with some new genres, some new forms of instrumental music that they began to write. Now, a lot of this we know, and we've talked about this in class before, that the only way we can know what happened in the 1600s, the 1500s, or the 800s for that matter, is if we happen to have a book or a paper that someone wrote about it that has survived to the present day. As I'm sure I've mentioned in class, if something happened and somebody wrote a book about it, but it was the only copy of that book, and that book was destroyed in a flood or a fire or something like that, then we may have no idea that something actually happened. Primarily, one of the major sources, or the major source, so we know what was happening with instrumental music this time, was written by Michael Praetorius. Praetorius is a very important composer of the late Renaissance, early Baroque, especially of instrumental music. As a matter of fact, his music from Terpsichore is what one of his collections is titled, is among the most popular of the early Baroque, late Renaissance, the style very similar, instrumental music ever written. He wrote a book called Syntagma Musicum, which means a systematic treatise of music. In other words, a comprehensive book about music, which has pictures of the instruments, prints of what the instruments are, and descriptions about what the instruments were and how to play them. So it's the major source of information about music from this period, instrumental music from this period. The high and low, hot and bas designations that we first talked about in the late Middle Ages, these are continued. High and low, high meaning loud, low meaning soft. One thing that is relatively new during the Renaissance is this concept of consorts, where they would design an instrument, they would build it in a variety of sizes to cover everything from soprano down to bass, sometimes even sopranino down to contrabass. If you remember when we went to the Pifaro concert, some things they played on a complete consort of recorders, for example, from soprano down to that giant bass recorder that he was holding, or crumb horns, brass instruments. All of these instruments were made in complete consorts covering the entire range, from soprano down to bass, or even wider than that. So, one of the other, and we've talked about this, the printing press. What an incredible effect the printing press had, of course, on society, but specifically on music. So, music printing enabled people to write more dance music because they could print copies of it and sell it. So they could write a lot more instrumental music that was geared for dancing. It was a popular form of music to sell because everyone wanted to dance. And remember, as I've said many times, in those days there were no recordings. If you wanted to dance, you had to have live musicians playing the music. In the Renaissance, people that were of a certain level in society, members of the nobility, the wealthy, the educated, were expected to be able to dance as well as read and perhaps perform music themselves. King Henry VIII, for example, was an accomplished composer. The performers would improvise based over the music that was written, or improvise just in general to provide music to dance to. And sometimes they would perform from memory. They would learn the music, they would perform it from memory. But dancing, it's kind of funny because in the chapter, first they talk about how in the Renaissance, in the late Renaissance, instrumental music began to be cultivated for its own sake and not just for dancing. And then they talk about how instrumental music was used extensively for dancing. Two things, both things can be true. So something that happened, interestingly enough, you actually see this in the history of a lot of kinds of music, other forms of classical music, like in Mozart's day, even through jazz, is the music was, sometimes people wrote a genre of music, a form of music that was intended for dancing, but eventually they began to expand on it a little bit, and it became music that was intended to be listened to, not necessarily danced to, although it retained the influence of this dance music. So works for lute, works for keyboard instruments, sometimes became very stylized, influenced by these different dances, be they in duple meter, be they in triple meter, or whatever, but they weren't intended to be danced to, they were intended to be listened to. Each one of these dances has its specific meter, duple or triple, like I said, tempo, rhythmic patterns, and even the structure and form. Form usually includes bracketed repeats around 4-bar phrases, very common in the time. I just want to mention that, remember at this time, the music is still modal. Major and minor scales have not replaced the modes yet, so when we listen to some of this music, you'll notice that the cadence points aren't as strong as they would be, say, if we're in a major tune, because it is modal. Frequently, this dance music, they would group in either a pair of dances or even 3 dances, a trio of dances. Actually, in some of the books that I play out of with my various chamber groups, we have music that's been arranged from this period where you will have a slow duple meter dance followed by a fast triple meter dance. Sometimes the same melody being used in both dances, sometimes a completely different melody. So, Pavane and Galliard, as a matter of fact, I have several things in my brass quintet book that are titled Pavane and Galliard, all from this period that, in this case, have been arranged for modern brass. So we're pairing up dances, combining dances in different meters and in different tempos. Speaking of music, however, that was meant to be listened to exclusively, one of the major output of this kind of music came from England, specifically from a group of composers who we think of today as the English virginalists. The virginal was another name for a harpsichord type instrument. What they would frequently do is compose a set of theme and variations. A lot of times these theme and variations were set on familiar songs or familiar dance patterns, and the variations would get increasingly technical, increasingly complex. We will listen to an example of one of these theme and variations. The most famous composers of this were William Byrd, who we talked about in chapter 10, John Bull, and Orlando Gibbons. Even though Orlando Gibbons might not sound like an English name, he was English. So these are the most famous of the English virginalists, but there were quite a few. Others, including John Addison, for example, is another example of an English instrumental composer, virginalist. So another thing, in addition to theme and variations we have, are these keyboard players, these lute players. They would improvise an introduction to a song. Eventually, this led to this composing music that was in a style that sounded like it was being improvised, but it actually was not being improvised. It sounded like improvisation because it's very free rhythmically and could get quite technical and play with the time a little bit, but it's actually all written out. The titles for these things were frequently things like preludes, fantasias, and even ricercare. Eventually, this makes its way through into the Baroque era, and then you even have, later in the Baroque, you have similar keyboard music that has this style that sounds very much like an improvisation, with titles like a prelude or a fantasia. Frequently in the late Baroque, of course, it's paired up with a fugue, fantasia and fugue, prelude and fugue. So these improvisatory sounding compositions, we have toccatas, we have a ricercare. Now a ricercare eventually actually becomes a more structured form of music. Just last week actually I performed a ricercare. And a canzona. Canzonas are interesting actually because canzona is from the French word chanson, which is song, because originally the canzonas were intabulations. An intabulation is actually a lute version of a vocal piece. So they were originally intabulations of chanson. in Italian titled Canzona. So, we've got our dance music, we've got our improvisatory sounding music. Ultimately, what many people think is the true high point of Renaissance, late Renaissance instrumental music happened in Venice, Italy, specifically at the church, at the Cathedral of St. Mark's at San Marco. So, Venice was an independent city that was run by several powerful families. The person who actually was in charge is named the Doge, or his title rather was the Doge. The centerpiece of Venice was the Cathedral of St. Mark. This massive cathedral, incredibly wealthy. Because of the location of Venice, Venice was a very rich city, and so there was a lot of money there, and they poured a lot of money into the Roman Catholic Cathedral of St. Mark's at San Marco. All these great religious services took place there, also civic ceremonies, sometimes in the plaza in front of St. Mark's. The most important position in Italy, and one of the most important musical posts in all of Europe, was to be the choir master, the head musician at San Marco. Some of the most famous musicians to come out of the Italian Renaissance, Adrian Villard, Cipriano Rore, Claudio Monteverdi, Andrea Gabrieli, and Andrea Gabrieli's nephew, Giovanni Gabrieli. They all served at some point as a choir master at San Marco, and these are all, especially Villard, Monteverdi, and Giovanni Gabrieli, among the most famous musicians to come out of the Italian Renaissance. Don't know how well you can see this on the video, but here's a painting. This is the Cathedral of San Marco there, and here's the piazza, the plaza in front of it, where there is a religious ceremony going on. Yeah, there are a couple pictures in here. Someone remind me in class, and actually I'll pull up the PowerPoint while we're listening to music and show you some of these pictures. But at the Church of St. Mark, I think what most people feel that the greatest music to come out of San Marco was by Claudio Monteverdi and Giovanni Gabrieli. Now we're going to talk about Monteverdi extensively when we start the Baroque period. But Giovanni Gabrieli composed some of the earliest large collections of purely instrumental music. Now, he took advantage of the structure of San Marco, and I'll get to that in just a minute. Wrote 100 motets, 30 madrigals, and about 80 purely instrumental works. Now these motets we refer to as polychoral motets because they are for multiple groups of singers, instruments, or mixes of both. So poly meaning more than one. Polychoral, multiple groups. This is where Gabrieli, there's a picture of Gabrieli holding a lute. This is where Gabrieli really took advantage of the architecture of San Marco. If you see this picture of the inside, here's a balcony, here's a balcony, there's another balcony, there's another balcony, there's a balcony back behind us in the picture facing this way. San Marco has balconies all around it, and so what Monteverdi would actually, what Gabrieli would actually do, although Monteverdi also did it, so he would put groups of musicians in different balconies, and then they would play. So the music he would write would frequently be an echo. The choir to the right plays or sings, and the choir to the left echoes that. These polychoral motets, it was the original surround sound, if you will. You're sitting there in the church, and the music is just surrounding you from all of these balconies. Gabrieli would write anywhere for 2 choirs up through 5. He wrote some polychoral motets that call for 5 different groups of musicians. It's really remarkable stuff. So, one of the things we're going to listen to in class is one of his canzonas, again, originally an adaptation of French chanson, eventually becomes an instrumental work. These ensemble canzonas, written for divided groups of instruments. Giovanni Gabrieli's, probably his most famous collection is the Sinfonia Sacra, Sacred Symphonies, published in 1597. It's a group of polychoral motets written specifically for instruments. 2 groups of 4 instruments. Sometimes you can do them with organ. I've performed these with not just, and conducted them not with just multiple groups of instruments, but sometimes a group of instruments and an organ playing opposite each other, alternating stanzas, and then at the loud points, everyone plays together. One thing that Gabrieli didn't do in this collection is he did not specify what instruments to play, but we know from records that were kept at the time that it's probably sackbuts, which is an early form of the trombone, and cornetos, which are an early form of the trumpet. Those are probably the instruments that were being used. So that's kind of what was happening with instrumental music in the Renaissance. There will be an online assignment accompanying this, and then in class, I think probably on Monday, we will have the opportunity to listen to and break down some of this music.